Today we're looking at the escalating Korean crisis. What are the military and political realities? What is driving the increasingly hostile rhetoric, and what purpose does it serve? Where does this leave negotiations with North Korea to disincentivize its nuclear program, and does the conflict have any imminent risks of becoming hotter? These are the issues we've been discussing with our guest speakers: James Edward Hoare, career diplomat in the British Foreign Office and academic and historian specializing in Chinese and Korean studies; Dr. Georgi Toloraya, professor and the director of the Center for Contemporary Korean Studies; and Konstantin Asmolov, analyst with the Korean department at the Institute of Far Eastern Studies here in Moscow. Tensions have increased markedly between North Korea, its neighbor South Korea, and the United States. The escalation comes as some 40,000 US and South Korean troops conduct their annual joint military exercises on the Korean peninsula. The US continues to affirm that this is to support its southern allies on the continent, but in the north. This had led to talk of a surprise attack. International media reported the North Korean statement, published on the country's state news agency KCNA, as reading that North Korea, and I quote, is entering a state of war with South Korea, and that all issues between the neighboring countries will be handled in accordance with wartime protocol. However, Russian media said that a faulty translation might have been to blame for this apparent uptick in bellicose rhetoric. Anyway, the United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said on Tuesday that a crisis over North Korea had gone too far. Well, now we are joined by our guest speaker, James Edward Hoare, British diplomat and historian, specializing in Chinese and Korean studies, coming to us all the way from London. Mr. Hoare, thank you so much for joining us, and it's a pleasure having you here. Now, what I'm trying to understand, and what I actually fail to understand, I can see there's a certain contradiction when we are looking at the situation at the Korean peninsula. I mean, there's every kind of rhetoric which you would describe as belligerent, to say the least. However, the international community seems to be reacting rather calmly to that. So what is it? Is it, when we're talking about statements made by North Korea, do you think that it is their usual style, or shall we take it more seriously?
It's very difficult to tell, and the problem with North Korea is that everything is always overstated. There's always a very high degree of rhetorical flourish to what they say. So, as I keep saying to people, North Koreans never cross the road. They stage a death-defying struggle to get from one side to the other. Some of what is going on at the moment is certainly rhetoric rather than reality. They are using phrases about going to war, about breaking off this agreement, cutting off contacts and so on, all of which they've done before, all of which are things that are quite easily reversible or just ignored if you choose to do so. So they've not done anything that really finally commits them to a line of action that might include violence.
But even if we imagine that they would like to do anything, do they have the capacity?
They've got capacity to act locally, certainly. I mean, they have a lot of concealed artillery, a lot of concealed short-range rockets. They can hit most of South Korea if they choose to do so. They can certainly hit the capital city of Seoul, which is a large, sprawling city. About 1/4 or more of the country's population lives there. So they are capable of doing some of these things. Now, a lot of what they have is probably pretty old and pretty decrepit, and some of it won't work, but enough of it might work to cause quite considerable concern within South Korea. I think they can probably also hit parts of Japan, including some of the American bases, in theory, because one thing that we do know about their rockets is that they're not terribly accurate, they're short-range ones, that they can be fine against something as sprawling and vast as Seoul, but would be far less useful against a very precise target, such as a particular airbase or a particular marine base in Japan.
So, but then what could be their ultimate goal? I mean, what's the use of talking that way?
Well, I think what's happened this year is that they were very cross, or pretended to be very cross, about the additional UN condemnations last year over their failed April rocket and then their more successful December rocket. So that got them into a state of anger, or at least pretend anger. The country has been under sanctions of one sort or another since 1950, but nevertheless they resent additional sanctions. And they're also worried that perhaps some of those sanctions might be enforced more strictly than in the past. Added to that is the further condemnation that came after the nuclear test, and I think the nuclear test was just to show that they weren't going to be told off by the West, by Russia, by any other country, by the United Nations, so that they engaged in that. That led to a further round of condemnation, which again sets them up into a high state of rhetorical rejection. And then you have this annual set of exercises with the United States and South Korea, which are very big exercises, very threatening, and every year the North Koreans go into a state of semi-war alert when these happen. And so you've got all this coming together, and that's, I think, helped to increase the rhetoric. But the reality is that on the ground there isn't the movement of troops or the placing of rockets that you would expect if they really intended to turn this into some form of attack.
Just to remind you, we're discussing the details of the escalating Korean crisis with our guest speaker, James Edward Hoare, British diplomat and historian specializing in Chinese and Korean studies. Do we happen to know what kind of sentiment there is in the government of North Korea? I mean, there's the new leader, the young leader, and he seemed, initially at least, he seemed to be rather open-minded.
There is a new leader in North Korea, and there were signs that he had a more friendly attitude to the rest of the world. The trouble is, that he is trapped within the system, that there's only so much he can do. We don't know how the inner workings of the top leadership take place. We just don't have any insight into that. So we don't know what pressures there are on him or how his thinking has evolved. But I suspect whoever was the leader, there would have been this high rhetorical reaction to these insults, as they see them, to the North Korean state and leadership. And there wouldn't have been any difference under Kim Jong-il than there has been under his son.
But it's interesting because it amounts to, I'd say, such a short-term reaction, because in the long run, I suppose that the Chinese must be very unhappy with what North Korea is doing now, because North Korea seems to be just giving a good pretext for Americans to build an American naval presence around China.
I think the Chinese are concerned that the way the North Koreans behave makes it more difficult for China in its dealings with regional powers, including the United States. I think that the Chinese have allowed a debate to emerge a bit in public about North Korea, partly to see what Chinese people are thinking, partly to see how other people react. But to be honest, I don't think the Chinese are just going to abandon North Korea because it serves a useful purpose. Yes, it may attract American attention, but it also means that the Americans are kept that bit further away from China. And I think that the Chinese are also concerned in a different way about the consequences of a collapse in North Korea. There is the immediate effect on them and possibly on Russia and possibly on Japan, and certainly South Korea, of large numbers of refugees, difficult to absorb, fleeing into these countries. There's also the question of the North Korean military with some form of nuclear capability being out of control. And so for the Chinese, these are all very worrying things, as well as the question of whether the United States would be able to operate further up the Korean Peninsula than it does already. I think the Chinese do not want the United States on the Yalu River. I don't suppose Russia does much either on the Yalu and Tumen rivers. So there's a lot of things pulling the Chinese in various ways. but I don't think they're going to abandon North Korea. And the way the Chinese approach the issue is very much saying, look, to both sides, calm down, don't engage in these high tension-filled exchanges, but calm down and actually try and get round the table and talk. Now, it's not going to be easy to get to that stage, but I tend to agree with the Chinese that the way to solve this problem is not by more rhetoric or by pointing your rockets at South Korea, or if you're the United States, flying nuclear-capable bombers into South Korea, but by actually trying to get back at the negotiating table. But it's not going to be very easy to do that.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was James Edward Hoare, British diplomat and historian, specializing in Chinese and Korean studies.
This is the Voice of Russia.
This is Burning Point, discussing the details of the escalating Korean crisis. And now we are joined by our next guest speaker, Dr. Georgi Tolorai, professor and director of the Center for Contemporary Korean Studies here in Moscow.
Well, I would say that this time is a little bit unprecedented because actually, as I've said before, Kim Jong-un is using Western's own tool, its mass media and public opinion, to reach his goals. He's trying to prove to the Western public that the North Korea is very dangerous, aggressive, and should be dealt with seriously. And strangely, the Western politicians who for years have received lots of military budgets for containing the dangerous and aggressive North Korea cannot deny this, although, of course, everybody understands that North Korea is not about to start the war, and that actually, if it starts the war, it will be annihilated. So there's actually no reason for North Korea to attack or to provoke the West. But at the same time, it gives a much stronger impact. It gives me the impression that Kim Jong-un decided to have a sort of decisive blow on the system of isolation and pressure on North Korea to try to prove to both the Western public and politicians that it's easier not to oppose North Korean regime, but rather to come on terms with it. I don't know how will this calculation be correct or not, but anyway, that's what he's trying to do, and I don't think that this cycle of tension, some kind of I would say assistance or some kind of concessions and tension again would persist, because what Kim Jong-un wants is to solve this problem of relation with the USA once and for all, to come on terms. If he is not successful, which is quite possible, then maybe North Korea would try some other methods.
It looks like Chinese position is trying to make North Korea talk to the international community.
Well, actually, it is North Korean utmost aim to talk. And not just to talk with the world community, but to get some concessions, to get the legitimacy from the world community, to prove to the world that they do exist and they have all the rights, and then that they shouldn't be ostracized. Therefore, it's the actual aim of North Korean, psychological offensive. The actual psychological offensive is just that, to get the world, and especially U.S., talking with them seriously in some constructive manner. So they need not be persuaded. And, China, I think, understands that, but any Chinese interference would be taken with great irritation in Pyongyang, because they don't want to listen to anybody's advices, and especially of advices of those who are stronger than them, whom they can consider be dominant. So I don't think it would help if China would try to make some, interference, some advices. Although, of course, China will and keep on telling North Koreans that the provocations and tensions is not in their favor. But North Korea, it plays a different game.
Senior Russian Foreign Ministry official Grigory Logvinov said on Tuesday that Moscow believed talks with North Korea over its nuclear program was still a possibility. Russia has urged all sides in the region to remain calm and has warned of the prospect of spiraling tensions. Moscow, and I quote, is against any statements and steps leading to the escalation of tensions and expects all the sides to exercise maximum restraint and responsibility for the fate of the Korean peninsula. The Foreign Ministry said in a statement, adding that Russia maintains permanent contacts with partners in the six-party talks, which include the two Koreas, China, the United States and Japan. And now getting back to our interview with Dr. Toleraya. What could Russia do in this respect, in this situation?
Russia's unique position of being possible to talk more or less calmly with all the partners, all the five countries, including North Korea. And at least North Korea is not taking Russia as a hostile power, and it's not seeing it as a dominant power like China. Therefore, Russian advice can be really valuable for North Koreans, and Russia should do like this. Although it's understandable that North Koreans will not listen to the direct advice, Russia should provide intellectual assistance and mediator's role in bringing the current tension to an end and to resume a diplomatic process. And this diplomatic process should be multilateral, six parties, although the issue of denuclearization, I think, is no longer on the table per se.
So what could Russia do to ease the tensions right now? I mean, the resumption of six-party talks is a rather mid-term perspective. What can we do now?
If I were the foreign minister, I would have a special talks with my U.S. colleagues, or maybe on presidential level discussion. U.S. should try to find some excuse to talk to North Korea directly and address its concerns and address its legitimate concerns. In this way, Russia could really help, and Russia can also stage some kind of a place or opportunity for talks between North and South to try to accommodate the different view of these two Koreas without making it too obvious and too public.
And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Dr. Georgy Toleraya, professor and the director of the Center for Contemporary Korean Studies here in Moscow. This is Burning Point, discussing the details of the escalating Korean crisis. And we're continuing our program with our next guest speaker, Konstantin Osmolov, analyst with the Korean department at the Institute of Far Eastern Studies of the Russian Academy of Science. It looks like this time it has gone a little bit too far in the standoff between two Koreas with the involvement of other outside actors. But what do we need to expect? What are the possible scenarios where it could go?
Well, generally, I don't see signs of a real threat. No signs of panic and so, no mobilization and actual moving of the army units in Jong-un. Generally, from the north side, it's only a war of nerves, and actually there are two things I am really afraid of. First one is that tension can lead to unpredictable consequences, like the incident of March 27th, when South Korean soldiers saw something, shoot a grenade, and I just like to imagine what would happen if North Koreans would see this grenade shooting and from their own positions will think that this shooting is on him. They would answer, then the Southerners will answer in return, and so on. So I hope that in this situation of mutual tension, the possibility of such a conflict, which was actually would be led by misunderstanding, is rising, and this is dangerous. The second point is the possible provocations, and maybe even not from the northern side, because I don't think that North Korean authorities have a suicide motivations, understanding the balance of military forces in connection with the alliance between Republic of Korea and the United States. On the other hand, there are some prominent groups in South Korea. They are actually followers of conservative course of ex-President Lee Myung-bak, and well, we can say that they could be interested in raising the tension, because if this would happen, they can keep their seats in power, and Park Geun-hye will have to keep the political course of Lee Myung-bak. However, I hope that both possibilities are not a serious threat, and I do understand that the large-scale conflict will not be instigated by the North Korea.
Why would emotions be running so high this time? I mean, South Korea has seen a new president sworn in, and this...
South Korea now has a new president, but new president, if we have to look more closely, have a number of problems with the forming of her own government. For example, still she has to work with the previous Minister of Defense. And this Ministry of Defense had even support from the United States. Remember the words of Chuck Hagel concerning Mr. Kim Kwon-jin. That means that opportunities of Park Geun-hye are less than she would like, and her arms are actually closed. Despite her own political life is aimed on the rebuilding of the mutual trust between two Korean states. And this can be more productive than the total confrontation of Lee Myung-bak's time.
I see. So, do you think, well, I know you said that you hope that the situation might be resolved in a peaceful way.
Yes, I do hope that the conflict would be resolved peacefully. I do hope that North Korea, and especially South Korea and United States, will take the reasoning and try to hold back those who would like to settle the question with the force. I hope the hawks will lose. There will be peace and prosperity on the Korean peninsula.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Konstantin Asmolov, analyst with the Korean department at the Institute of Far Eastern Studies of the Russian Academy of Science. And with this we end.